adversely affected by the full reopening of the border only in October 2021. And also travel restrictions amid the Omicron variant and limited flight availability. Year-on-year inflation accelerated due to higher fuel and food prices and freight costs and the depreciation of the rupee. Inflation increased to 6.8% at end December 2021 and further to 10.7% at end March 2022. Staff projects growth of 6.1% in 2022 and a further rise in inflation. The war in Ukraine has weighed on growth projections due to lower growth in trading partners, less optimistic prospects for global tourist flows, and worsening terms of trade. Nevertheless, the economy is expected the recovery is expected to continue, driven essentially by the tourism sector. The mission expects tourist arrivals to reach about 60% of pre-pandemic levels in 2022. That is slightly over 800,000 tourists. Air connectivity will need to be improved to effectively support the recovery of tourism flows to pre-pandemic levels. With every additional 100,000 tourists, growth could increase by 0.6%. Annual inflation is expected to further rise to about 11.5% in 2022 due to surging fuel and food prices, the past depreciation of the rupee, and recovering domestic demand. In face of increasing fuel and food prices, the mission recommends protecting the vulnerable population with targeted transfers through social safety net programs, while avoiding broad-based subsidies benefiting all income levels. As the recovery solidifies, further fiscal consolidation is needed to restore fiscal space and ensure debt sustainability. Mauritius' public debt, which rose notably amid the pandemic, is set to stay at elevated levels in the medium term. As the economy exits the pandemic, reinstating fiscal rules, including a medium-term debt anchor, would help preserve fiscal sustainability and reduce debt vulnerabilities while allowing for flexibility to address shocks. Reforming the pension system remains a critical step to support fiscal sustainability. Any medium-term fiscal consolidation plan will have to address the disparity between pension spending and pension revenue. The mission recommends fiscal consolidation through credible revenue and expenditure measures. The goal to reduce the stock of public debt should not justify deploying quasi-fiscal financing, for example, by the Mauritius Investment Corporation. While quasi-fiscal measures can help reduce debt in the short term, they can delay fundamental fiscal policy actions and lead to renewed pressures in the medium and long term. Improving effectiveness of monetary policy and safeguarding the central bank independence need to remain priorities. The Bank of Mauritius exerted a welcome effort to modernize its policy framework, and the mission recommends the rollout of the new framework to take place as early as possible. Tightening the policy stance would be appropriate to control inflation and counter unanchoring of inflation expectations and second-round effects. Consistent with the BOM Act, the government needs to cover BOM's losses, which may materialize due to increasing policy implementation costs already in the near to medium term. Consistent with the new monetary policy framework, the exchange rate policy should allow for greater exchange rate flexibility. Improving the legal framework and addressing governance issues are important to allow further safeguards to the central bank independence. The ongoing review of the banking and central bank legislations is welcome, and the mission advises expediting their submission to the Parliament. To support policy credibility and remove unnecessary credit risk from the BOM's balance sheet, the mission recommends the BOM to relinquish ownership of the Mauritius Investment Corporation, the MIC to return undispersed financing to the BOM, and avoid quasi-fiscal financing. BOM's ownership of the MIC weigh on the BOM's independence and blur the separation of monetary and fiscal policies. In addition, the MIC competes with the financial sector for some profitable projects. The MIC can either be taken over by the government or folded into the Development Bank of Mauritius. Exiting the Financial Action Task Force list of jurisdictions under increased monitoring, the so-called FATF gray list, is commendable. Staff welcomes the authorities' reform efforts to continue strengthening its AML-CFT regime, particularly as related to non-resident and cross-border activity. Diversifying the economy will remain critical to support the recovery and Mauritius' aspiration to become a high-income country. To achieve this, the authorities need to consider policy options to reduce the shortage of suitably skilled workers. Greater digitalization should help further promote diversification and move up the value chain. Addressing climate change is another priority to help the economy build resilience against shocks. Diversification and improving the resilience of the economy need to be supported by a comprehensive reform agenda to identify priorities, address obstacles, and increase efficiency, including by finding complementarities between the public and private sectors. The agenda could be formulated in consultation with the private sector and civil society. So this covers the main findings of the mission and what you'll see in the press release. Thank you. You can have a copy. You'll have a printed full copy. Yeah, and it's online. It should be online by now on IMF website. For the fiscal year, you're asking not the calendar year, but for the fiscal year. What is the forecast for GDP, I guess?
For the current fiscal year, real 5%. Yes. July to last year is going to be 5%. Yes. And this is consistent with the 4% in calendar year 2021 and 6.1% calendar year.
You know, in you can think of it as the average of the two. We see it as baseline, which means it is not conservative, it's not optimistic. We have had discussions with the authorities, with the private sector, the hotelier and restaurants, with the private sector more broadly. Based on those discussions, based on flight availability, and based on the impact of the war in Ukraine on the growth prospects of source countries for tourists, we decided that 800,000, slightly over 800,000 is baseline. It can go above that, and it could reach 900,000, and we would be very happy if that happens, but that's not the baseline for us. So there is seasonality in tourism. We looked at the numbers. The first few months of the calendar year are slow months, and then it picks up in April. Then May, June, July, it slows down again, and towards the end of the year, it picks up. Now, towards the end of the year, assuming that the flight availability improves, and assuming that the war in Ukraine does not worsen the prospects for the global economy, we think that 800,000 is achievable. 900,000, 1 million, possible, but more optimistic scenarios for us. We have discussed both with the government and the central bank, some of the options to achieve the objectives of the government through other ways. How to unwind the MIC and the timing of it is up to the authorities. Our preference is that it is transferred to the government, folded into the government or into the development bank as soon as possible, and that it doesn't extend any more loans. So in terms of timing, our proposal would be the sooner the better. We discussed it at all levels. The MIC, we have discussed at all levels, both with the governor and finance minister. We have reiterated the recommendation to transfer it. There is more evidence now that the MIC is involved in quasi-fiscal financing. By that, what we mean is that some of the expenditures that should go through the budget, the budgetary process, are done by MIC. And we would rather have fiscal expenditures happen within the fiscal framework rather than outside the fiscal framework. So we see more quasi-fiscal expenditures by MIC. What we have also heard from the financial sector is that the MIC is competing on some profitable projects. So that also enters into crowding out some of the projects for the financial sector. So we see more cases why MIC should be folded into the government sooner rather than later. And we have made these points to the government and the central bank at all levels. Public sector debt levels, I can give you numbers and where we see it by the end of, for example, this fiscal year. By end of June, just to looking at this one, yeah. Yeah. So by the end of this fiscal year, we expect debt to GDP, public sector debt to GDP ratio to be slightly over 92%. And by the end of next fiscal year, we expect it to come down to 88%. Now, our view on debt is that public debt to GDP ratio has gone up substantially during the pandemic. And that has been the case in many countries. And that comes as no surprise. But now, going forward, as the recovery solidifies, the government needs to bring debt down gradually over time through credible revenue and expenditure measures. So we are not focusing only at the levels, but how it is done, so that debt doesn't come down quickly through other quasi-fiscal measures. On that front, we have done some analytical work, and as part of this Article 4 consultation, we looked at what could be a debt anchor for Mauritius. Is 60% appropriate? And we use different approaches. And from those approaches, we find that Mauritius' debt carrying capacity is higher than 60%. It can be as high as 80%. So on that front, we recommended to the government to look at, to think about an appropriate debt anchor and work towards that anchor through fiscal rules. Fiscal rules bring discipline to the budgetary process, and it allows gradual decline of debt to GDP ratio. The authorities will need to look at it themselves and find what is the appropriate number, exact number for them. We shared the studies. But to answer your question, 60% is difficult to come down to, but may not be necessary to come down to either. Because, for example, Mauritius' revenue to GDP ratio is higher than many comparable countries. And when we look at debt carrying capacity, debt servicing capacity is important. So Mauritius' debt servicing capacity is higher than many countries. Indeed, public debt is a goal. Fiscal anchor introduces a goal. It introduces an anchor, and from the fiscal anchor, we go back to the operational rule. What's the operational rule? The operational rule is the fiscal deficit. So every year, what should the fiscal deficit be to get to the anchor of X%? With that, the government would need to look at revenues, expenditures, what are priority expenditures, and in capital expenditures, what are the priorities, and implement them based on priorities. So it would include all expenditures, including capital expenditures. We have not suggested specific tax rate increases. there are ways to increase taxes. I mean, one of them is increasing VAT efficiency here. So how much can be collected without changing the rate. So we compared, I mean, our experts at the IMF have compared the VAT efficiency of Mauritius to other island economies and also international financial centers, because those are the comparators for Mauritius. And we found that there is room to improve. That's a recommendation. There are other recommendations, but not necessarily tax rate changes. These are, improving efficiency or more revenue administration, I would say, than tax rates. Their inflation is picking up fast, and inflationary expectations can pick up along the way. And much of the inflation right now is imported inflation, but at the same time, as inflation remains high for a while, it can feed into expectations. And we see some signs of that, at least in the short term meaning, over the year. So our recommendation to the central bank is start tightening. And advanced economies have started tightening. I'm sure you're following what's happening in the US. Many emerging markets have started tightening even before the US. With monetary policy and tightening, it's important to act before it's too late, because from the time interest rates go up to the time you see the impact on the ground is about 12 months plus lag, and it's important not to miss the boat. Some countries are finding themselves a bit behind the curve on inflation. So our recommendation for the central bank is for the central bank to start acting now.
Interest rate is at 2%, so we really are lagging behind in terms of normalization.
I can't give exact number, but I can tell you that we were expecting more than 15 basis points increase in the last increase. I mean, that was a marginal, very, very marginal increase.
Something the association saying, according that the MIC should provide funds to the most vulnerable. So, what's your take on that, on the use of MIC funds to support the most vulnerable families?
To provide assistance to transfers. First of all, our recommendation for in a period when inflation is increasing fast and when the vulnerable population is spending a lot more on food, and food is a large part of their consumption basket, it's important to protect the poor. And that's a recommendation that we are making. Through transfers, using the current social safety nets. What those transfers should come from the government. They should come from the budget. MIC money is the central bank's money. So MIC supporting the vulnerable would be equivalent to central bank providing transfers to the vulnerable. So the point about supporting the vulnerable is a good one. But who supports the vulnerable? It should be the government. It should come from the budget, not from the central bank.
Government budget. So I think that the fiscus should reimburse this such monies to the central bank once that the pandemic is over and we start getting the normal growth rate.
First of all, our stance on the transfer was that rather than a transfer, which is a grant from the central bank to the government, there are other ways of using central bank financing. Many countries used loans from the central bank through mostly through secondary market, but some through primary market. In the case of Mauritius, it was a transfer, which means a grant, large amount. In the middle of a crisis, it happened. We don't go back to what happened, but what is important for us now is that the central bank should have enough, should be recapitalized. The central bank should have enough capital to be able to do its function, which is monetary policy. Reduced capital, small capital, should not be a factor for the central bank to hesitate to implement monetary policy. So now we're emphasizing that the central bank needs to be recapitalized so that it can play its role. And during the pandemic, the monetary policy was accommodative, understandable. It was the case in many countries, but now is the time to tighten. And as interest rates go up, the cost of the central bank operations will go up. So to be able to implement monetary policy, central bank needs to be recapitalized. So we don't comment on that, but let me give you the recommendation on exchange rate policy. We recommend exchange rate policy to be such that the interventions, market interventions, are only to dampen excessive volatility. This is a flexible exchange rate, so it needs to adjust as the market requires. But central banks, in a flexible exchange rate system, central banks can still intervene to avoid too much volatility, to give some more certainty to markets. Sure.
So you said that you're active with captains of the private sector.
Mm-hmm.
So that's going to be said in once again in layman terms. What's the message that you've got from the private sector with regard to the state of the economy, with regard to growth and the structural issues impacting the economy and the public finances right now?
We have met with different private sector groups, and the message from them is that outside the tourism sector, the other sectors have gone back to more or less to economic activity level at the pre-pandemic, during the pre-pandemic period. For the tourism sector, there is people are all expecting tourism sector to recover, but the degree of recovery varies. And there is a a band, I would say. Some people say, oh, it could be 700,000 tourists. Some people say 800, 9,000. It's the tourism sector where there is some uncertainty. In terms of structural issues, this is an economy which has diversified very well over the years. And to Mauritius' credit, since its independence, it has diversified from a monocrop economy to a well-diversified economy when we compare it to other island economies and small states. But it can do better. So how to diversify it more is, that was discussed with the private sector. And the message we get from many stakeholders, groups, is that shortage of skills is a key concern. And how to improve the education, training, how to bring more talent into the country. And there are different ways of addressing the problem. But shortage of skills is an issue. On the state of the economy, I think people look to us to look at the macroeconomy. I think people are finding that the pandemic was as difficult for Mauritius. Mauritius was one of the hardest hit countries. So, coming out of the pandemic and recovery now is welcome. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And now this is obvious, maybe 40% of the foreign FDI went from
So in terms of diversification of the economy, we're thinking about more value-added sectors. Higher value-added manufacturing. The government is thinking about pharmaceutical, medical devices. It could be other areas. I think as skill comes in, there could be other opportunities. IT sector is another one where there is more opportunities. In terms of exports, the free trade agreements with India, with China are good opportunities for Mauritius. Proximity to India, and we met businesses that export to India, and that works well. And for Mauritius, it's a small economy. I think it's a matter of finding niche products to export to these countries, and it doesn't need to be too much, but some high value added products would add to output. Your question on construction. When we look at FDI in the past 5-6 years, 50% of FDI is in the construction sector. And it adds to the economy and it's good, but construction sector is not known to be productive sector. It adds to the economy while buildings are built, but beyond that, it's not like a factory that keeps on producing and employing people. So in that sense, increasing FDI inflows to more productive sectors would be better for Mauritius, of course. the way we look at it is the country was hit by the pandemic, hard hit by the pandemic, and some measures were taken. I mean, large, comprehensive measures were taken, and those measures supported the, I think, social and economic stability. What we are looking for now is to make sure that those measures do not create pressures in the future. So the focus of the Article 4 is not just what happened during the pandemic, but medium and long term, and to make sure that the measures taken during the pandemic do not lead to, do not lead to pressures down the road, and the fiscal and debt can remain on a sustainable level. And that to us is consistent measures over time. So if debt went up by a large amount in a short period, that is, it needs to come down clearly, but it doesn't, we're not expecting it to come down in a year or two. It's not realistic. But we do want it to come down gradually in a reasonable amount of time, and that reasonable amount is 5 to 10 years, with measures that are transparent and within the budget and not outside the budget. So I would say that's a forward-looking approach. How to protect the vulnerable? Well, our understanding is that the government already has identified households, and transfers can be made already to those households. Now, can the net be broadened? Perhaps. We have also heard from civil society that some people who are having difficulty now with the sharp increase in prices do not get included in that net. Perhaps, there is room to improve the net, but there is a net. So our recommendation is to use the social safety net and transfers to the vulnerable. Subsidies are not sustainable. There is not room in the budget to support subsidies, and subsidies benefit all income levels, and that is too costly. And in fact, in the end, subsidies go more to the higher income levels than lower income levels. Pardon? It defeats the purpose, exactly. Yeah. You're welcome. Thank you.
Jamile, we have a question from one of the press in the Zoom. So it reads as follows. In relation to the foreign currency reserves, there has been reports that there were shortages on the market. It has caused a depreciation of the rupee, resulting to rising the cost of living. Is there a short-term solution to the problem? End of question. Thank you.
There is an echo. Could you read the question again?
Okay, I'll do that. So in relation to the foreign currency reserves, there have been reports that there were shortages on the market. It has caused a depreciation of the rupee, resulting to rising the cost of living. is there a short-term solution to the problem? Thank you.
Okay. So the question is foreign exchange shortages in the markets leading to depreciation. Short-term solution. Our recommendation is, again, for the central bank to intervene only to prevent excessive volatility in the exchange rate. The tourism sector is recovering. As the tourism sector is recovering, there will be increasing inflows in the market. I mean, the shortages in the market, we realized that they were large amounts because tourism came to a halt. But right now, when the economy is recovering and the tourism sector is recovering, those there will be more inflows, and the central bank should let the flexible exchange rates continue. Exchange rates will adjust based on the market supply and demand. Other questions?
Yes, we have another question. The question reads as follows. It's from Kavisen Senivasan. Is there any risks with the intervention of the Bank of Mauritius with a reduced capitalization of the central bank? I suppose it says, is there any risk with the intervention of the Bank of Mauritius towards the reduced capitalization of the central bank on the forex market? That's the question.
Again, the interventions of the central bank, the interventions are not, I mean, we don't see them as a risk. The interventions are in a flexible exchange rate regime. The central bank intervenes in the market only to prevent excessive volatility. This is how flexible exchange rate regimes work. With that, this also supports the effectiveness of monetary policy implementation, and we have highlighted that it's important to implement monetary policy and start, tighten monetary policy. So it is in that context that we recommend the intervention policy. Not that it is, we are not referring to risks. It is how monetary policy and exchange rate policy work together.
We do not have any further questions, Jamile. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much. I should add that the staff report will be discussed by our board, the IMF board, mid-June, and it will be published around the third week of June. And you will find a lot more depth on these issues, and also special issues papers focusing on some of the areas that we have discussed. A brief? Yeah. So we are at mid-May, and by third week of June, the full staff report will be published. Yeah? It's actually we are doing a fast track Article 4, so there is not much lag from the mission to the publication of the report. Okay.